Hello, everyone. Just a quick public service announcement. When this is over, lunch will be served on the 4th floor. Quick note: it will not be served till this is over, so don't leave early. So thanks everyone for coming. My name is Greg Sixt from the MIT Abdul, Latif, Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, or JWAFS, where I'm the director of the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, or the FACT Alliance, which is a global research network of over 20 institutions focused on integrative research for addressing real-world challenges. On behalf of JWAFS and the FACT Alliance, I'd like to welcome you to this breakout session titled Food Trade and Global Change, Implications for Food Security in an Increasingly Uncertain World. If that's not what you signed up for, you're in the wrong place. Today we'll be introducing the Jameel Index for Food Trade and Vulnerability. The Jameel Index was made possible with a generous gift from Community Jameel. The Jameel Index is the inaugural project of the FACT Alliance. So, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker and panel today to discuss the food trade and climate change. Our keynote speaker is Professor Kenneth Stresbeck. He's a climate and water food specialist at MIT's Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI, visiting fellow at the Martin School of the University of Oxford, and professor emeritus at the University of Colorado. He has over 45 years as a researcher and practitioner at the nexus of engineering, environmental, and economic systems. We then have Dr. C.G. Yang she's an agricultural economist in the Global Department for Agriculture and Food of the World Bank, where she manages the portfolio of the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program. Dr. Linus Mofor is a senior environmental affairs officer at the African Climate Policy Center of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, working on climate resilience and green and just transitions. And Paula de Almeida leads the food and agriculture portfolio for Pegasus Capital Advisors, leading investments for 2 large sustainable development funds focused on the Global South and accredited by the UN's Green Climate Fund. So without further ado, Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. And so this is an auspicious place to be in between you and lunch. So the only one worse is the session after lunch when you fall asleep. So if we hear any rumblings, don't worry, we want to get you to lunch here. So I'm very pleased and honored to be here today to share with you, to set off this session, some work that the FACT Alliance has initiated on trying to come up with metrics of food trade and vulnerability for the purpose of serving in looking at food security. And so today I'm speaking for a large group of researchers who from the globe who have been working together, and we'll see that a little bit later. So I take responsibility for all errors, but this is a team effort. Let's see if it goes. There we go. So I think one of the really interesting things is if you look at global food trade, over the last 25, 30 years, it's really been growing almost exponentially. And the interesting thing is growing particularly in the developing world. And so food trade has become a way for us to look at some of the issues of food security. And we see it's a global issue, and there are many threats that that coming into such a complex system, which we're trying to capture in the Jameel Index. So this system is incredibly vulnerable, and this is one example. This is what we call a maritime choke point, that most of the food going to the Gulf goes through the Suez Canal, and this was the evergreen that blocked the canal for 2 weeks. And so that's a threat we don't think about. A recent threat was 60% of Egypt's wheat comes from Ukraine or Russia. So that threat is there. There are threats of climate from drought and floods affecting the supply chain. So how do we measure that? And then the other thing is we start talking about trade, and we'll see this a little bit later. Some of the threats come, what if we don't have the money to pay for imports? So we have other threats, development threats. So what is the need for this index? Well, there's lots and lots of data out there. So we have an expression in the modeling world, drinking from a fire hose. There are, if you see at the just at FAO, there's zipped over 365 megabytes of data on food trade. There's another food balance too. What's in there? How do we distill that to make some policy decisions? And so the goal of this tool is to go from data to insights and try to do this. So this is the initial tool. We had a team of a number of people from around the world, 12 experts in the field helping to review it, and then 35 others through inquiry bringing data in here. And what we're trying to do is link and look at this issue of food security and food self-sufficiency. And they're not the same. If you look at the Gulf countries, they're importing over 90% of their food, but they're food secure because they have the resources to buy that. So trade is this link together. So as we look at trade, how does it impact that's coming out a little bit below, that's security. This is accessibility. The 6 pillars of food security is accessibility, and then this one's sustainability, and then this one here is access. So we're looking at those things, and so what we tried to look at is where does trade fit into the bigger food security issue? And this is not a food security index, but it's the food trade vulnerability in this first phase, and we want to link it to it later in the others. So the way this framework comes about is at the bottom we have these variables over a gigabyte of information about the last few years, and then we have indicators. So we boil that down into indicators. We then do something which we call meta indicators, which we'll talk about, which is aggregating things, and then finally we come to what's called a composite index. And so the 5 meta indicators that we're looking at is how dependent are you on imports for your food? How much is your feed? Because many countries import feed to have a local livestock sector. Do you have the funds for an exchange to pay for that? And then your partners that you're bringing from, are they a stable supplier of food, or are they highly variable? They're in a country where lots of variability in the climate and production. And then finally, do you have a robust supply chain? How many countries are you connected with in case there is a problem in the supply chain? So one of the ways we brought this together and why we call it this meta indicator is we looked at 8 commodities, which are the main commodities traded in the food world. And we came up with an index where we weight it by these parameters. What is your food dependent ratio by crop? How important is this to your diet? So you may bring it all in, but you don't use it very much. And then we have something here known as the food consumption score. And it's an attempt to say how important that is in a nutrition sense to your meeting the traditional nutritional needs of your country. And then we finally come up with that commodity score, which is weighted, and then we sum it across those 8 commodities. So a country that has different dietary patterns and food consumption will have a different score depending on that. So then we go to the Jameel index, and following lessons from the human development and others, we use a geometric weighting, so you can weight this by each of those sectors. And these are the sectors that look at access and availability of food, the food dependency. And you see here for 6 countries how they rank in 2020. And then these are 3 of the other ones, the exchange rate. And then finally what we do is by bringing them through this geometric weighting, we come up with the final index. And why this is important, what we want to point out here is the UAE is extremely vulnerable. Almost 95% of their food or more, and some 100% is imported. So they're extremely vulnerable, but they end up with a medium Jameel index, the composite index, because they have that. And if we look at Egypt, which is medium, medium, and high, they end up being high because they are vulnerable across almost all the sectors. So trying to look at that, and we spent a lot of time looking at the mathematics of that as well. So what are we learning from this? So if we look at the globe, what we find out is that 14% are either medium or highly vulnerable. Nobody's in extreme yet. And you look at that population, and the average calorie consumption per person in the globe, which is the flaw of averages, is 3,000. about 29. So we look forward, but if you look at the second row with nations, there is 51% of nations are high or extreme. So where we're seeing these issues, a lot of small nations are dealing with these issues. And they're the ones with the least resources to address these issues. So this is where we're seeing that. If we then go look by income, what we see here is low and middle income. The low incomes, they're not very vulnerable. They're mostly low and very low. And then if you look at even lower middle, but then look at the column kcals. That's the available calories in those countries. Look at what you see in lower, it's 2,300 on average, and then here in the rich north, we're 3,488. And so one of the reasons that it's low is they're not eating enough. So they're not importing it because they don't have the money to import it. So we want to be careful that we're not sending the wrong message with the index. And in the phase 2, we're trying to link it with food security because these things together. And then if you look at nations, though, again, it switches from population, and we see as we look at the nations, low-income nations now, in the middle income, almost 51% again are in higher or medium. Now, one of the things we're talking about as we go forward is we look at regions, and then you can take a quick peek at these regions and you see who's important for both population and nations. But one of the things Linus has mentioned as we talk about it being in a regional UN organization is we have to solve problems through regions because they're having similar issues, and that's one of the lessons we're learning here. The other thing is, over time, this isn't a static index. They're being driven by that reliability of what's happening in the exporting countries, what's going on there, and that can impact different countries over time. And then finally, our goal here, which we're not quite there yet, is how do we look to the future? We want to look at how global change, economic growth, or the change of fossil fuels affecting certain countries, and then climate change, how is that going to affect that? So we've been living off of data, terabytes of data. How do we go to the future? And we use models. So we're working with IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and their Globe Impact System to look at food trade and the impact. We start with agricultural models of water and food. We model the global system. But then what we're doing is we're then looking at bilateral trade, which is very important. So one of the new things we added, we're standing on shoulders of Mark Rosegrant and others who have built the impact tool, but now we're building a bilateral trade model because that's so important in your partners in the vulnerability here. So as we go forward and you look here, what's happening. So this is one model of 37 that we've run, but just to let you know, look at what's happening. Next to the last column is 2050 without climate change, the last one with climate change. And look at global trade in in cereals, it's dropping from over 200 to less than 100. What does that mean? If we then start looking here, the Americas, it's dropping. We look here at Europe and the former Soviet Union, it's increasing there. So this particular model of climate and everything is showing Ukraine, Soviet Union, and Russia are going to start exporting more. Other countries are losing. And then so totally globally, we lose about 134, 180 coming alone from the Americas, but it's being made up primarily by the Soviet Union. That's a scenario. Is that going to happen? What is geopolitics adding to that? But one of the most important things we want to see that's just really important is South America. South America switches from being a net exporter to a net importer. Are they ready for that? Where are those imports coming from? They're used to trains going to the ports to take the food away. Is it the right place to get it back in? How do the ports have to change? So these are the kind of policies we can look at. And then here's the thing for sub-Saharan Africa. Their imports are going down, but also their consumption's going down significantly. So they're having both domestic production issues as well as the cost of world market is going up, so they can import less. So we have to make sure in our framework that we look at how this is impacting nutrition and calories and things in the country. So what are the emerging findings we're coming from here? 14% of the globe, medium to high, but 51%. This becomes an institutional issue. These countries don't have the institutions that are going to help them prepare. So we have to work with them, and we really need the private sector working together in public-private partnerships, and we'll hear more about that. The other one is these regional similarities we're starting to see. East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, for example, Southeast Asia, some of these similar things. How do we get the regional organizations to work to bring together on that? The other thing is we saw that there's year-to-year variability. One of the things we're seeing for climate change is we expect in our preliminary work, we're getting more floods and more droughts. It looks like we're going to need more storage to deal with that. And then finally, climate change is going to have major impact. And finally, low vulnerability in many low and middle income countries is due to lack of the ability to import. And we need to, how do we do that? We have to strengthen the other sectors in those countries to be able to import or boost their local production. So this tool is there aimed for generating knowledge, using people to basically get into that set of data. And the next steps is there's now a beta website. We're in the final stages of finishing, jameelindex.mit.edu. And on there, it's a dynamic index. You can change the weightings. So you can say, I don't care about feed. That'll go away, and then you can get a new index, make it yourself. And then we're going to allow you to have a portal into all of that data that we look ahead. So we're going to roll out early 2025. We'll have the historical set ready, and then in the summer we'll have all the climate change runs from the many simulations we're doing. So I thank you for your time and excited that our panelists will take off from this.
Thank you, Ken. That is a great start to a very interesting panel I'm happy to be speaking with today. So I'm going to dive right in because we've got about 30 minutes before lunch. So I'll start with you, CG. Your work at the bank focuses on global agriculture and food security. How does trade fit into that issue?
Thank you very much. Thank you also, Ken, for a really nicely presentation. So yeah, I mean, like in the bank, like we, I mean, it's also, you know, really for the recent like food crisis, which we see that like trade has been really become a really critical issue for food and nutrition security from different aspects. First, you know, like for people who work in the agriculture value chain, they are employed by the agriculture sector, and then those are usually the poorest people, and then they generate a lot of income opportunity, job opportunity for them, and you know, access to the trade could really help them to really like explore more like profits, and then the trade liberalization things can also, you know, reduce like the cost, improves affordability, and then really like help for like poverty reduction. And beyond, you know, like people who directly work on it, but trade also in a time that really bring a variety of food on the dining table, really like enrich the diets and then provide nutrition that were not being locally available. And of course, you know, another is that it's really also de-risk a lot of what we see, that, you know, when there was like a local shocks and things, when you bring trade in, it can really help the, you know, really like look more on the global demand and the supply side. And really like, you know, stabilize the supply and, you know, smooth like the prices. So which, you know, like, for example, in the like the recent food crisis, we did see like really initial shocks. But what we also see is that in a later stage, there was shows the trade system has like demonstrated resilience. That it is through like some initiatives, you know, or like, you know, the trade, to diversion from like, you know, the markets and from like coming from North America, and then and also some initiative, for example, Black Sea initiative, and those is really like help like smooth it afterwards. So like it really brings more like a stable access to food and nutrition.
Thanks, Shiji. So in many regards, you know, trade enables dietary diversity and can support many aspects of food security. And in fact, we're finding to date, the global food trade system has been relatively resilient. What we learned from Ken and what we're learning from the Jameel Index is that this resilience is potentially at threat. So we're going to keep building off of these as we go. So I'm going to go to you, Linus. So your work focuses on climate change and development in Africa. Food security in parts of Africa is very much at risk from climate change. How could a tool like the Jameel Index support policy, planning, and investment towards attaining greater food security resilience in the face of climate change?
Thank you very much, Greg, for your question, and thank you, Ken, for a wonderful presentation. And I want to also congratulate the Jameel community. This is a very powerful tool. And Ken, I like when you finish by saying, when you go to the BETA website, you see a dynamic tool, right? That is very important for policy. It means policymakers can go and say, for me, I want to prioritize this, and that. What would that mean? You know, that's a powerful tool. But back to your question, Greg, it is very important. And as Ken made in the presentation, climate change is one of the biggest things we are having, right? And with climate change comes all of the things that we know, more extreme events and so on, but also shifts in agroecological zones. So it means that things that are growing here today may no longer grow here anymore, but things that never used to grow somewhere may start growing there and so on. So this tool, I think, from where we're coming from as the Economic Commission for Africa and the Climate Policy Center, is that we can leverage and do synergy with this tool and what we've developed called the crop suitability mapping. So under changing climate, what is the likelihood of what will grow where, right? And if we can combine that with a powerful tool like what the Jameel Index is, I think we can really address the issue of food security. But, there is a but, is that if we listen to what the presidents, like President Hassan and President Bayo, President Adesina were saying earlier, even if you had the food without the infrastructure, so I think this is one of the things that we need to look, the food cannot go to where it is needed. So therefore, maybe we need to see how can we build infrastructure. And then, you just asked, Shiji, you were talking about trade. We have now in Africa the biggest trading bloc, the Africa Continental Free Trade, that became operational a few years ago, about ensuring that there is a free movement of people, goods, and services. But without the infrastructure, even with the will to get things move around, the things wouldn't get there, right? So that is really, really key. And I always want to cite this with what I call my chicken in Oslo experience. And my chicken in Oslo experience was that my Norwegian friend invited me for their National Day, 17th of May. When we were there one evening, we were eating chicken, and he said, oh, this chicken, we bought it from Sweden because it's so expensive in Oslo. And then he said, I'm sure that the shops in Sweden were supplied by the ones from Denmark, which is closer to Europe. And then he said, and I'm even sure that the shops in Denmark got the supplies from Germany. And I wouldn't be surprised that the chicken was packaged in Poland. But I said, sure, that is the beauty of it, because today in Oslo, you wanted to eat chicken, you ate chicken. So I think when we can combine all of these factors and then say, now we shouldn't be feeling the threat of climate change, but if we ensure that there's trade, there is infrastructure to make things move around, and we can now be able to have the opportunity to feed everybody everywhere and have food security, because there is plenty, and we've been hearing that all along, there is plenty of food that can go around to feed people, but with the right tools like this, and help policymakers make the decisions that they need to make so that we can ensure that food is available where it is needed, even when climate is changing, so that the climate change now is no longer a threat, but is an opportunity for investment, an opportunity for policy, for regional integration, to ensure that we are all in it together so we can have food across the board to eat. So I think for me that is a powerful thing, and I will look forward as the African Climate Policy Center how we can combine the Jameel Index with our crop suitability mapping, and then how to see how that can then support policy making together with regional integration as a way of addressing food security.
Thanks, Linus. The story of the Oslo chicken by way of Denmark, Germany, and Poland really demonstrates the complexity of our global food trade system and the need to understand this complexity and understand this complexity in the face of global change. This is something that Ken and I have been talking about as we've been working with the team to develop it. Is what's needed and what can we build as we continue to evolve this. So really looking forward to continuing this conversation as we move on as well. So Paula, you have private sector engagement. So how is the private sector engaged with food trade and its role in supporting food security?
Yeah, thank you. And I think these points, especially the slide Ken, that you showed the connected world is so critical, because you talked about this chicken from potentially Poland all the way up. Speaks to the interconnectedness. And the private sector, frankly, wants to help the world transition food systems into more sustainable, resilient systems that not only are efficient at feeding 8 billion people around the planet, because we have to be honest, we still have to ensure that everybody has access to food, safe, affordable, nutritious food, and that food is ensuring nutrition equity, which your slides also talked about severe risk of nutrition equity, and even the nutrition equity that we have in the system sort of reverting and regressing in terms of climate impact. And so from the private sector, obviously, we always think about what are the best systems that we can invest in, the most resilient, the most sustainable, that actually allow for those two things to happen: food security for all and nutrition equity for all. And so structuring the investments, understanding the maturity curve, and these kinds of indexes are really helpful, because they start to map out the specifics around what kinds of interventions, what kinds of solutions in the system are actually going to help from a foundational standpoint for many other solutions in the system to take. I think what's important for us to acknowledge is that there's a lot of science and technology available in the system that yet hasn't been put to scale quite yet around the world. But it needs to be anchored on foundational pieces. You talked about storage capability, removal of food loss and waste. We were talking earlier around food safety capability. All of these things are foundational for some of these more frontier and, frankly, sexier technologies to take root and help in this totality of the portfolio of interventions and toolkit that we want to bring to life to ensure food security and nutrition equity for all. So when we go to invest, we're obviously looking at all sorts of mechanisms to de-risk that investment, because we want that investment to be at scale. It's not enough to just invest in a proof of concept or even in just a proof of scale. We need to invest in solutions that can really scale up, and at scale is a critical word here that oftentimes gets lost in some of these conversations. But in the process of de-risking, you really have to understand the maturity curve of some of these systems that you're deploying the solution to. So where do they sit in that evolution, and what's the best foundational piece that comes to play? So that's a bit how we think about it. And obviously, we want to take the best knowledge that's available in the system so that we're making really well-informed decisions. You know, financial markets are very good at dealing with complexity. They can appreciate it if it's well-known and acknowledged. But I think with some of these changes, and you talked about the potential for climate risk to really shake things up, because sometimes you cannot predict for what's coming and how impactful it will be in specific supply chains. And we forget that an impact in one specific raw material and crop has implications for many others, because it puts pressure on the whole system. And that means that you know, this kind of information sometimes creates unknowns in complete holistic risk management exercises. And so having the best available data in the system to understand the interdependencies to begin with allows for informed investment decisions that actually take root.
Thank you. Ken, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of what you've heard and ask some of the panelists questions if you have any. If not, I can carry on. Any thoughts you've had from what you've heard so far? Oh, go ahead. There we go.
Yes, no, thank you. I mean, if you're just building from what Paula was saying, and one of the things that we've been hearing here is about, and we heard that from the two presidents earlier, about agribusiness opportunities for young people, right? So, because I know you're going to answer the question, I wanted to bring this one in. Do you see opportunities for young people to be able to use a tool like this one to try to figure out where they may want to focus their energy, and therefore be able to go into agribusiness from the call of action that we heard from the two presidents, and then saying that if I can use a tool like this, it can help me to come up with an agribusiness model that can enable somebody like Paula to see an attractiveness to invest in me? Is this something that the tool can also help? So thank you.
Okay, I have two answers. One is, I have an expression in my life: it's better to bear the shame than bear the pain. And I have to get up to do this, because I don't know if it's because my age, but we do have some handouts, which were left in my briefcase. So I'm going to put these at the back of the room while I answer, which is something on the Jameel Index. So my answer is, downstairs is a youth conference, but one of the main things that we've done with the Jameel Index is that we have been working with training. So we're working with Malawi, and we're also working with Ethiopia. And part of this is we're trying to do training, and then the other thing we learn is that how people view these problems are different generationally. So one of the things we do at MIT is we have what we call undergraduate research opportunities. So we have a series of undergraduates working to help develop this tool targeted towards the way they view it. So for example, I said, you design the interface that is for your generation, because I might have pull down menus or whatever. They're going to do it in the way that they feel comfortable. We also have something called MISTI, which is cross-cultural. So some of these are going to be going to Africa this summer, and we're going to try to bring some, as we do the second phase, not just have, North American students working on it, but African students working on it. So the idea is to make it open and changeable, just as you said, to change the weights. So if I care about stability because I'm older, but somebody cares about growth rather than risk, they can change that in the index. The other thing we're doing, which this talk about the index was to stimulate this, but we're also doing national work with IFPRI, where we have national models that can look at this within a country, because trade has to get inland. So if we think of a country like Tanzania, well, they have the port of Dar es Salaam, but is the food going to get to Arusha? Does trade matter? And that's where you brought up this whole infrastructure. So the World Bank has been working with the something Linus started, the African Climate Resilience Facility for infrastructure. And so we have to look not just at food, but the whole infrastructure issue of roads, and also building it to be climate smart and building it better so that we're dealing with this uncertainty. And the other last thing was the uncertainty is raising the costs. So the whole problem of not knowing and agreeing on a climate policy is adding costs to the developing world, where they're going to more than double the amount of infrastructure they have in the next 50 years. It's going to cost more now because we don't know what the future is going to be. So they have to plan for that risk. So if the world would just say, we're going to do this and we're going to target, that will greatly reduce the uncertainty and change. Because as I said, when we do the climate change, there's almost 100 different scenarios. I just showed you one. There's going to be a good scenario, but what's the likelihood of that? Do we want to take that risk?
Can I offer a point here? Because I think the point's being made, and something I think want to bring to all to consider. There's, if we think about the fundamentals of human dignity, 5 in my mind, some we can debate what they are, starting with water, access to safe, drinkable water, food, health, shelter, and education. When you shake those fundamentals, nothing else sits on top. Right? Stability, civil society. And it's easy to take those for granted when you have continued access all the time to them. I think there have been events in the world recently, and Linus, you've seen this firsthand even in Africa with some, the war in Ukraine, lack of access to wheat, now many African countries not being able to even feed, daily staples that are part of their repertoire. That is a reminder that it's very easy to take these situations and food security and trade implications and policy decisions for granted. And so I'd welcome everyone to think about the fact that, while it's food systems and agricultural systems can be perceived as complex in terms of resolution from a sustainable development standpoint, there's an absolute urgency right now for us to really not just talk about it anymore, because we all know that we have potential and opportunity. I don't even want to talk about a crisis or a breakdown, because I actually think the system is doing exactly what it's been incentivized to do. And the question is, are these the incentives that we want to continue to see in the system? The answer is clearly no, given what the climate and the planet is telling us, that we need to do something dramatically different. So we should sit down and talk about what incentives do we want to see out of this system, in the ideal system, operating system from planet Earth, and address some of the pressing issues and challenges that are right here in front of us. So I think, just recently there's been a lot of conversation around water. Parts of the planet do not have access to water or will not have access to water, which, by the way, without water, you don't have food. So some of these pressure points that you have elevated in the index are so critical, because also they will indicate where do you have the most opportunity for investment to fix, right? Where there's massive risk, there's massive opportunity. You can flip it. And that means that then you need to start searching, not necessarily in a panic mode about what you're going to do about it, but most importantly in an intelligent way to think about what are the package of solutions and interventions that will actually flip the system and create opportunity all around.
Thank you. And I want to pose this question, unless anyone have any follow-up comments to what Paula said? So I want to actually ask the panel a broader question is, so there's a lot of opportunities coming as well, right? And we often talk about public-private partnerships. I actually want to say public-private academic partnerships. Where are some of the opportunities that we might see? Because the other thing that we're doing too is we're continuing to develop the Jameel Index. So as we're doing that, we're looking for ways we can improve it as it evolves. What are some opportunities you see at the nexus of public, private, and academia, or research more broadly, in this food security trade space? I'm going to leave this an open question for anyone to my right.
Let me get going why they think they answer. One of the things that we want to add to this is we all talk about, there's discussion about having the carbon footprint printed on all of our food that we buy or any product. One of the things we want to add is something about sustainability. So one of the things we can do is, what's important is if we think about food coming from the rainforest and what did that cost, the market's driving it. So, but is what we call it the externalities, are they addressing the externalities to the Brazilian people and to the ecosystem? And then the other thing is people talk about water, and one of the things is there's blue water and there's green water. And here in Iowa, on the eastern side, it's rainwater that's providing the water. On the western side, it's irrigation. If that rainwater, it would have grown a tree. If we grow food with it, that's sustainable. But on the other side, if we're bringing down the aquifer and depleting it, that's unsustainable. So we have to be careful that we do things with nuances and don't overreact. But adding things like that is, what is the sustainability behind this particular product and this food, to that even though we can pay for it, we might be causing problems in other places. So trying to extend that to another indicator, saying, well, how much of your food is sustainable, or giving you an index. Your import portfolio is unsustainable or highly sustainable or in the middle. It's somewhere where we want to go.
Thanks, Ken. I want to give a couple minutes for the panel to respond, and then I'm going to actually pop out to the audience. We have about 8 minutes left, so I'll let some of you folks respond. Shiji?
Thanks. I mean, it's very enlightening to discuss on this. So I think, in terms of really this collaboration between academics and then, public-private, I do think, recent crisis, what we also see is that a lot of times the policy makers is more reactive when you see a crisis coming. And I think, seeing a Jameel index like this is that you can really plan things, you can see it in a more medium and long term, well, the pathway to the vulnerability in the food system from the trade side, right? You see it from your currency, it's from the climate change. You can really help you to analyze it for the policymakers to be more proactive in addressing predict future crisis that may come. So I think in that case, I do see there's really a lot of benefits for using such index to bring into the dialogue with the policymakers, for them to have more far-sighted vision when they are making their policies.
Thank you. Linus, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds, and then
Okay.
if I'll come out to the audience for the last 5 minutes. Go ahead,
Okay.
Linus.
Now, just a quick one, and to build from what she was saying. So, what I wanted to ask, okay, what is the opportunity to democratize this tool, right? What I mean by that is, so is it an opportunity for universities and research institutions in countries to begin to apply this tool based on their own national circumstances, situations, and so on, and begin to play around with the options and so on, right? So that, for example, I know I come from Cameroon, and when the war in Ukraine happened, the prices of almost everything went up. People say, oh, the war in Ukraine, even though it's talking about things that were produced locally using the same infrastructure, but everybody blamed the war in Ukraine, right? So is it possible now to democratize this tool, to diffuse it in ways that research communities can begin to, or communities of practice, so to speak, with certain interests can begin to use the tool and play with it around their own sense so that they can also then inform the policymakers, give the policymaker more of some kind of level of confidence on how they can make policies and so on.
And I have a quick answer to that, and if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand up. I'll go to you first. But as I walk down there, one of the efforts in which we're trying to democratize this tool is right now we're training colleagues in Ethiopia and Malawi on the tool. As we move into phase 2, the goal is to increase the level of training and then actually empower people to use the tool themselves and help us improve it, and ask the right questions. So was it you had the question?
Really interesting. Thanks so much. One of the things that I've taken away from this week and thought was a interesting way to frame nutrition is the comment about nutrition being framed as an investment in human capital. And so I wonder if how this has been incorporated, if at all, past K-cows, so more even looking at more micronutrients, dietary diversity, different sources of food. Thanks.
Yes, so one of the things is we have a student who did his master's degree on looking at protein calorie balances in this, and then the other thought is in Paulo, where we were discussing this yesterday, of how we can broaden this to look at micronutrients and other things that would be needed. So the index is just going, so we said, let's do what we can do simply correct, and then build from that. So we're working on a phase 2, which is we're getting some support for general, but we're also doing specific things. And one of the things we're recording here is going back to a couple funders on what people are asking for. So that's why in the back, I wanted to make sure we got those out, is the email you can email to and go to the website and respond if you think there's something. We're collecting those for the next generation, because I think the word is democratization. We want to make this available and be able to grab that, because the download data is huge. So one of the things we're hoping to do with Linus is to partner with regional universities so that they develop it themselves. If it's Python that they want to develop in, it's just a framework. We'll help them redo it, process the data, and make it to be appropriate for your questions that you're asking locally.
Any more questions in the last 2.5 minutes? Yes. Also, if you could just introduce yourself. Sorry, I didn't ask you to do that. Yeah.
This is Guaya Wu from Texas A&M University. I like your concept about energy intake. In humans, in different countries, energy intake would be very different. In developing countries, most energy comes from carbohydrate. In some countries, most energy comes from protein. So it's good in your model. You have the proportion of food intake from animal product, the proportion of food intake from plant product. That may help.
We do weight that in when we look at the food import dependency, we weight it by animal gets a 4 and carbohydrates get a 1. So in making what is important. So if you are, let's say that all your proteins were imported and all your carbs were local, and you would get a very vulnerable, you'd get a high vulnerability because the weighting of the protein. And so, but that's one of the things we didn't want to do here was step beyond our expertise. So we're reaching out in the second phase to work with food security people to bring that in appropriately. So it's a very good question. We tried to weight it so that we don't include all calories equally, but in the second phase, we want to do one of two things. Either make it be linked to a food security index that's already existing, or bring a reduced form of that together with the Jameel. So either way that people feel that is appropriate. So it's a very good question.
I was just going to say, I think, given both questions, something that we were talking about last night and that we're predicting, once this tool gets more miles into the system and roots into the knowledge and people start leveraging this, my hypothesis is that it will start forcing a conversation around rebalancing of food baskets around the world, and it will start forcing this conversation around how do you want to distribute the calories and the intake, and which calories are going to be more relevant than not in repertoires throughout the world, right? We already see conversions, and I think this speaks to the point you were asking earlier on. I guess you invented a new acronym, right? PPAP, yeah. I guess.
Or PAPE.
However you want to go for it. But the reality is, for these solutions, we're going to need all hands on deck. But everybody doesn't have to do everything at the same time.
Absolutely.
Everywhere, which means that information like this will start to inform what's the right sequencing and who needs to come to the table first to drive the informed decisions that then allow for the investable projects to come forward, for folks to do the right evaluation from an infrastructure standpoint. What are the things foundationally that you need to prepare so that this rebalancing of food baskets for nutrition equity can come through? So I think what's really critical here too is not just that academia is putting this out, but it's putting in context for a systems intervention, because this is really what we're doing, right? We're doing a lot of systems thinking that now requires systems interventions that's multidisciplinary and requires a whole set of actors to come together to really relay race. It's not everybody doing their own thing independently and hoping that it all reconciles at some point. I think this is the key point related to your partnership there in relationships, which will force a conversation on how do we pivot the world on rebalancing the food baskets.
Excellent remarks to close out with. We are out of time. I'm just going to close this out by saying thank you for coming. We appreciate the questions as well. As we move towards phase 2, we'll be looking for feedback, and also one of the beauties of the FACT Alliance that's a part of this is that we have a network we can draw upon. So as we start to get into some more of the food security elements, the nutrition elements, we'll be bringing in some of the other collaborators from FACT to integrate that into the models. Also, we haven't touched aquatic foods yet. There's an opportunity there. So thank you all. I cannot believe the hours or the 45 minutes has already gone by. I don't want to hold up, speaking of food security, I don't want to hold anybody up from eating. So big round of applause to the panel. Thank you very much.